Greetings, friend. Welcome. Welcome to this review of Darksword Armory's Mother of Dragons sword. Today we will be discussing the component parts of this sword, looking at some of its handling characteristics, and observing several cut tests to assess how this sword performs as a functional fantasy blade. We're going to begin our review with a general introduction to the Mother of Dragons sword. Now this sword, you can see, has some interesting features on its guard and its pommel. Just the overall hilt is different from what you normally see. But what makes this sword particularly interesting is these seemingly fantasy designs actually have a historical basis. And that basis comes from a dagger in the Wallace collection that is labeled capital A810. And I will be referring to it as 8A10 throughout this interview. Now, the interesting part about these two, the dagger and the swords, when you put them side by side, they look very much alike. The only major differences are in the guard, principally, a little bit to the pommel, a little bit more in the grip or the handle here. And that's because this short sword is supposed to be a Game of Thrones inspired sword. So it underwent a few cosmetic changes in its basic components to bring it more into line with a fantasy theme. That's a particularly interesting part of the sword because it is a functional fantasy piece, but also to some lesser degree a historical piece as well. Now, breaking down just a basic introduction to the general parts, the blade is 5160 high carbon steel. From the tip to roughly here on the sword, it measures 20 inches. When you look at the handle, about from here to here, it's 4.25 inches. For an overall length, counting the guard and the pommel, the little extra distance there. Overall, from tip to pommel, it measures 26.25 inches. And its overall weight is 2 pounds, 9 ounces. So, nice little sword, nice little short sword, not too heavy. Before we dive into the review of the Mother of Dragons sword, I need to introduce two swords who are going to interject biases into this review in one form or another. The first of those swords is the black sword here on the wall behind me. This is a windless Battlecry Agincourt sword. I have had this sword for a year and a half, and I've been training with it in the Italian longsword style for just as long. The second sword is this little guy over here in the corner. Some of you will recognize this as a fencing épée. I have trained with this kind of sword for several years now, I think 2 or 3, maybe 4 years. And I train with this also 3 times a week regularly at a local fencing club. So these two swords I just need you to be aware of because I am accustomed to how they handle and how they perform in my hand. And that's going to create some biases in how I perceive the Mother of Dragons sword here. For one of the notable reasons being, if you compare it to the Agincourt here, there's a size difference, blade length difference, even a grip difference, stuff like that. So make of that what you will, but I would have been remiss not to let you know about these biases so that you can make your own assumptions and your own conclusions when you see me handle this sword and listen to me discuss how this sword performs in my hands. We are going to start our discussion of the individual component parts of the Mother of Dragons sword with the blade. Now, as I've said before, the blade measures from tip to right about down here, 20 inches long. Its point of balance is roughly about here, a little bit forward, a little bit back, right in that general area. So it feels really well balanced. It's not super blade heavy. The edges are straight on both sides, very nicely done. The tip is nice and straight. There's no warps, no bends anywhere that I can see. Consistent with the A810 dagger that inspired this sword's design, the Mother of Dragons sword has a hollow grind, and the spines running down the blade, created by that hollow grind, are nice and straight. They don't wave, they don't squiggle, don't drift anywhere, so nice and straight. Very well done blade-wise. I also opted to get this sword sharpened by Darksword, and they put very nice bevels on both sides of the blade. Now, bear in mind that we haven't even gotten to the cutting test yet, but from what I can see of the bevels, they're barely there. They're very discreet. It's very difficult to see them even with the naked eye. So Darksword did a good job with the sharpening process on this sword as far as aesthetics. We will discuss how well the sharpening process did more in the cutting section. At this point, we are going to flip the sword over and begin our discussion of the component hilt parts with the pommel. As you can see, this is a very nice fig-shaped or garlic clove-shaped pommel. It's got dark recesses of antique finish that offset the bronze scale patterns along the ridges here, and also the rope patterns above and below. It looks very nice from a decorative standpoint, and it actually looks very, very similar to the A810 dagger that inspired its design. The darker finishes and the scale patterns are really the only major alterations that took place between the two pommels. Now, from a functional standpoint, this pommel is super comfortable. It has great value as a functional piece and not just as a decorative design aspect. And that in particular comes from the flatter shape here. So theoretically, you probably wouldn't actually do this because of the grip design here, the little swell. It affects where your hand wants to be on this sword. But if you wanted to push your hand down up against the pommel, it'll lie flush against the pommel, and it's actually very comfortable. It doesn't rub or anything. It feels nice. It fits really well. So the fit right there is very nice. Additionally, if you wanted to, again, you wouldn't do this with a one-handed short sword like this. This would be more appropriate to a hand and a half or a two-handed sword. But if you really wanted to, you could put a second hand on this pommel, and it wouldn't interfere with your ability to handle. I think it would actually help, in my personal opinion, because the recesses here will match up to the bones of your hand, and you can rest the bones of your hand in the recesses, and it fits pretty well. There's really no hot spots to be created. And you can also, when you wrap your hands around, your fingers can fit into the recess too. So it actually affords a very secure grip and a very comfortable grip too. So if I really wanted to, I can swing this around two-handed, no problems. No problems. Highly impractical, but it's just something I want you to be aware of. Our next hilt component up for discussion is the grip here, also called the handle. And this is the biggest departure from the A810 dagger. I'm just going to make a note of that from a decorative standpoint. The A810 dagger is a silver wire wrapped grip. This is ebony wood that you can see is octagonal in shape, and it's also got a brick pattern carved into it. Now, I'm going to make a note on this brick pattern real quick, because while it does have some functional value, the flip side of that is it can create a hot spot for the hand. So if your hands are not as accustomed to outdoor work or swinging a sword around, maybe they don't have calluses or maybe they're just soft, it doesn't really matter either which way, but you might find that this grip hurts your hand a little bit and creates hot spots and maybe irritates a little bit. For me, I don't have that problem though. I find that the grip pattern creates a nice amount of friction so that when I'm holding on to the sword like this, I have no fear of accidentally dropping it, having it slip out of my hand. It almost feels like the sword is grabbing onto my skin as much as my hand is grabbing onto the hilt. And that can be a good thing just from a secure peace of mind aspect. I'm not going to let go of the sword. The other departure is the swell here. That is not on the A810 dagger grip that I've been able to see. But I like where it's placed because it's the right distance from both the guard and the pommel that neither of these two components bump into the hand when you're handling the sword. So you can see where my hand is sitting here. And so when I'm swinging, like this, I'm doing a little bit so I don't hit the computer, the guard is not going to hit my hand in any way. My hand is also not going to sneak up against the guard like this because that doesn't fit right. The swell wants to fit right there in the hand. The other part with the pommel, as you see here, I'm going to step back, and then if I do a thrust, the pommel, it rests against my wrist. The recesses in the pommel do help prevent it from really digging into my wrist. But the nice thing is that the large circumference here doesn't dig into the bone that's right here in my hand. I've had that happen a few times on some of my other swords that I play around with. It's not the most comfortable thing, but this pommel does not do that at all by virtue of where the swell on the grip is placed. So Darksword did a good job on this for a one-handed sword grip. So last but not least of the hilt components is this very unique, pretty guard here. Now this guard, again, like all the other component parts of this sword, is inspired by the A810 dagger. Like the Mother of Dragon sword here, the A810 dagger has a dragon head on one quillion and the dragon's tail on the other quillion. It's not super functional because with the inward curve of these quillions, you're not really going to catch another sword blade on the guard or be able to do certain fighting techniques like you can with the windlass Agincourt back there, or a sword of similar design. This is really more of a decorative guard than a functional guard. But the nice thing is that it doesn't interfere with the functionality of the grip or the pommel or any of the handling abilities or cutting abilities of this sword. So that's a really nice thing, that you can have a super fancy guard like this that doesn't interfere with the rest of the sword's functionality. That can sometimes be a problem with purely decorative aspects of a sword. I will make a note on the decoration quality of the sword though, and that's the level of detail in this bronze dragon head. You can see smaller than the pad of my thumb. That's a pretty small dragon head, but the detail is so fine. They have dragon teeth inside its little mouth. They have a nose. They have dragon eyes on it. They also have the horns, nicely done, and a very beautiful scale pattern. The camera that I'm using right now is not going to do this justice in any sense of the word. So I've put up an image of the dragon head just behind this section of the review so that you can see it up close and see the level of detail work that went into this decorative guard. It's a very beautiful guard. I think this is my favorite aspect of the sword, and it's the part that's inspired me to buy the sword. So as far as functionality is concerned, not very functional, but as a decorative piece, it is very beautiful. So, having discussed the individual components of the sword, it is time to step back and discuss some of its handling abilities and its characteristics. I don't think this is going to be any great secret to anybody, given some of my comments in the component parts of the sword, particularly where point of balance and grip are concerned. So there's no secret that this sword does handle very well. I think it handles very well, at least for me. I really like it. And what I like the most, I think, is where that point of balance is, honestly. Right about here, it's not super blade heavy. Its point of balance actually, proportionally, is very similar to that of the Windlass Battlecry Agincourt I own. It's also very similar to my fencing epee. So I'm very familiar with this point of balance region, and it feels very good because I know how to control momentum already and how to control cuts at this point of balance. But it cuts very nice. I like that not having super blade heavy, I can control the momentum of the sword. I can redirect the sword if I need to on the fly. It almost turns on a dime for me. So I have no concerns there about handling aspects or even control while I'm swinging it around. If I'm swinging and I decide, oh, I'm going in the other direction, I can do so quite easily, no strain on my hand or my wrist or my arm. So that's really good as far as cutting, or not necessarily cutting because we aren't cutting anything here, we're just practicing dry cutting. It feels really, really good. Thrust-wise, very similar, not super special, although having the weight, some of the weight in this sword is really nice because when I thrust, it starts the momentum. Once I get it going, it'll just keep going. I don't really have to push it. When I'm training with my Windlass Battlecry Agincourt and my fencing epee, sometimes I have to push them a little bit to get the momentum for it and keep them going. This sword has just enough weight for me to start the momentum and keep it going, but at the same time, when I'm ready to stop, I can stop it, and so it doesn't ever get out of control. So as far as handling, I like it a lot. I think it works really well. As I've said before, when you're doing cuts, the pommel doesn't interfere with the hand at all. If it does touch the hand, your hand is highly likely to rest in one of the recesses here on the pommel, in part because of the octagonal grip. So that helps you align things properly so that nothing really bites while you're handling it, nothing interferes. Overall, it handles really well. Now let's go see how it performs in the cutting tests.
Not even close.
That just bludgeons.
Just a few words on the cutting test that you just saw, particularly the ones where there were no videos to compare to, being the paper and the melon tests. Paper test was giving me a little bit of trouble. When I was trying to cut, it would not readily cut. It took me a few failed tries until I could get it to shear the paper. It wasn't a clean cut by any means. It was just, I had to shear. And that's where you see all the rough edges. I've seen swords cut a lot cleaner than that. My black sword, for one, behind me, cuts a lot better. My friend Mitch's swords cut way better than even that. So not the best cut on paper. The melon, really didn't have any problems with the melon. I think my only error there was that I fell short on the blow because I'm accustomed to my windless battlecry sword with a longer blade. So I misjudged my distance. I cut through it halfway, so I was using like this section of the blade. I wasn't really using this area. It was all up here. So the melon test, I fell a little bit short, but it still cut really well. I was still pleased with how it went through the melon. Water bottles was having a little bit of trouble with, mostly due to what I thought was form, but it looks like it was both form and edge. Shout out to Mitch on that for helping me out. Thank you for helping me test the sword and confirming that there is some issue with the edge not being sharp enough, so it's not all my form. Otherwise, I never would have found that out without your help. So thank you very much for helping me out, because I know you're watching this review. It was very much appreciated. So now that we've gone through our cut tests, let's wrap it all up and go with the final conclusion. Having gone through the individual component parts of this sword, done some handling with it, actually a lot more than what I showed you in this review. I've been playing around with it a lot, and I really enjoy swinging it around. I've also done some test cutting, not much more than what I showed you in the review, but a decent amount. My conclusion on this sword is that it is an excellent little functional sword. It does have great fantasy components to it, very nice decorative attributes, but the thing I like the most about this sword is those decorative attributes do not interfere with this sword's functionality. Quite to the contrary in a couple of instances, most notably the brick pattern on the grip actually enhances its functionality and its performance because it gives me a very secure grip, even more than I would if it wasn't on there. So that I can really appreciate. And I also appreciate the level of the fit and finish that went into this sword. The whole hilt altogether looks like it came out of a seamless hole. Somebody obviously took the time and the effort to make sure that the handle was carved to fit the bronze. Everything's nice and smooth. The transitions are very difficult to spot. You really have to look for where the color changes on this sword. It feels really good, though. All that other stuff aside, none of this decorative stuff interferes with my ability to cut with it. Definitely doesn't interfere with the thrust. I will note that while it wasn't sharp enough to go through the water bottles really well, as you saw in the cutting tests, the way this sword handles when cutting is excellent. So when I went through that melon that you saw, I did fall short. I only cut halfway through it rather than all the way through it, but I didn't feel when this sword went through that melon. I just heard the sound of the sword passing through and then basically saw the cut appear in the melon. But otherwise, I did not feel anything or have any indicator that this sword had struck something as I was cutting through it. So this is a very well-made, functional sword with some very nice fantasy attributes, even some historical attributes if you're looking at the A810 dagger. Very nice dragon motif. That was very well done. A lot of attention to detail. If you're curious about this sword's price point, it was between $535 and $620 US, depending on what kind of scabbard system you want or if you want the sharpening system. But it seems like at that price point, this is a really, really good deal, especially with the level of detail and the fact that it's also an excellent functional sword. So if you're curious and you want to learn more about the sword, there's a link to its sale page on the Darksword Armory website that is linked below in the video description if you want to go learn more about this sword. But this is definitely a sword that if you like this kind of fantasy theme, and you've been looking for a functional fantasy themed dragon sword, this is definitely a sword that I would recommend to you, especially if you like short swords and you want something that you can actually play with and not just have sitting on a wall. So that's my review of the Mother of Dragon's sword, and you are welcome to my observations to do with what you will and make your own assessments about this sword and whether or not you might even possibly want to add one to your own armory. Thank you very much and have a great day.